Afghanistan has gone to crap. Anyone with a working brain, mind, or even imagination could have guessed this, but our president obviously doesn't have any of those. So, what's going on? How is it impacting everyone? And why did this all happen? Well, honestly, I can't answer mostly any of those questions, but I can begin to think about it. So, way back when, in April 14th, earlier this year, 2020, Joe Biden announced that by 9/11 he would have all of the troops pulled out of Afghanistan, which on its face seems like a very confusing date to do it, just because it's like, it's 9/11, this is when the attack on the Twin Towers happened, you're gonna give the country back to the Taliban, then the guys who attacked us. Whatever. It was a weird idea, but he was all for it, and so I guess, Commander-in-Chief really don't have any power there. So he began to make plans, and this was following a long path of prior presidents, even from Bush to Obama and Trump. Everyone wanted to pull out of Afghanistan ever since they got into Afghanistan. But Joe Biden, whether he had the stones for it, or if he just lacked the mental capacity to stop himself from doing it, he went for it anyway. And just a few days ago, he finally closed down the U.S. Embassy in Kabul, completing America's flee from Afghanistan. And this has been a very sad fate to watch. Personally, I mean, the footage there sucks, and if I knew how to put footage onto these videos, I would include some of the people being shot or killed, or people trying to jump on planes to flee the Taliban rule, but I'm not that smart. So, anyways, there was a skeleton force left in Afghanistan, about 2,500 troops, spending roughly $44 billion a year, which sounds like a lot, but when you're pumping $8 trillion plans into the economy, that's really just a scrap of the barrel. Biden later had to fall back on his initial pulling out of Afghanistan, and now he is up to sending 7,000 troops into the country, but my source that I have says 5,000. It's a CNN source, so take it for what it's worth, but it's already wrong. But the number of troops being sent into Afghanistan has been changing rapidly over the past few days. It originally started with 4,000 who would be entered into the country, then to 5, 6, and now it's at 7, which is insane when you think about it. But in Biden's defense, the Taliban are really taking a stronghold of Kabul, which is where the U.S. Embassy is at, and Afghanistan more generally. They started their campaign way back in April 14th. When Biden announced this plan, the Taliban started marching across Afghanistan, taking whatever small refugee camps and cities they could. But eventually they started to realize that the U.S. wouldn't do anything about their campaign, so they just decided to take over Kabul, which is the largest city in Afghanistan. It's where the U.S. Embassy is held, and it's pretty much our point of reference to Afghanistan. It's actually where the President Ashraf Ghani lived until he fled away. So one of the big points of Biden's takeaway from Afghanistan was to make sure that there was no contractors left in Afghanistan, which is, it's just rotten on its own. I mean, I understand the initial military takeaway, like you don't want to risk any forces, you don't want to force people to go over there, but private citizenship contractors, I mean, these are just people who want to be there for their job, and yet Biden wasn't allowing any of them to be in Afghanistan. And this posed a really difficult threat when the Afghans had no idea how to fix their planes and their helicopters that the U.S. gave them. And so, I mean, they had Zoom calls to try to, figure out what was wrong with their Blackhawks, but, I mean, come on. It's a really tough thing to experience. I don't understand what the president was thinking. I don't understand why he's still going through with it. And I don't really understand why anybody would just be so strong-willed and such a bad thing to do. But as time went on, President Biden decided that that initial pullout date on 9/11 was too late, and the Taliban really wasn't giving him that much time. So the new date is August 31st, although new information has told us on that he will not remove all military personnel until all American citizens are out of Afghanistan. For reference, there's about 10,000 still scattered about in Afghanistan, although with their new strategies, they're taking about 5,000 people out each day on their planes. But there's still a lot of citizens left in Afghanistan, and there's about 100,000 Afghans still there. And most of these planes are filled with Afghan citizens, not with American citizens, so, it's a little confusing. Speaking of that, the Taliban and groups like ISIS are going through door to door and finding American citizens, journalists, news anchors, covers, anyone of Western descent, really, and they're killing them because that's what they do. It's a horrible, horrible situation. One of the downsides to this whole fiasco is that Afghanistan is still really overwhelmed with coronavirus, believe it or not. So their hospitals are still super busy with that, and now they're getting gunshot wounded people on top of coronavirus infected people, which, it just makes the whole infrastructure crowded, and in a country where you don't really have that good medical system, it's just throwing a wrench into the whole thing. There's hundreds of people being killed or injured. There's targeted attacks and assassinations on individuals who are even associated with America. A lot of the translators for the army have been being hunted down and killed, or at least beaten. One interesting point of news was that the Russian embassy actually said that the President Ashraf Ghani fled with 4 cars and a helicopter full of cash. At the moment, I think I found this like 2 days ago, they didn't know where he was. Eventually he came out. He's in the Arabian Emirates, which is an interesting place for the president of Afghanistan to be. But, taken from his perspective, these barbaric cavemen have just invaded his country, and what good would he do to stay there and try to implement diplomacy when he can just flee to another country and still, talk a big game and not show for it at all. Another cool thing to note, not really cool, but interesting thing to note, is on that every single video you see of these people trying to flee Afghanistan, all the people trying to hop on the outside of planes just to get out of there, it's more predominantly males, which is kind of tough to see just because personally I couldn't understand any man with, any testicles at all fleeing away from his wife and children who are about to be killed and raped by these just monsters of people, but yet these Afghan men still decide to flee their wives, their children, their families in search of, I guess, their lives, really, which kind of makes sense because the Taliban will kill all of those men, and they will beat them brutally, and it will not be a pretty sight to see, but at the same time, I don't know, I couldn't flee my family, so to see them fleeing theirs, it's almost a spit in the face. It's a horrible sight to see. As the U.S. Embassy evacuated to Kabul, and as a lot of the Afghan men, more predominantly, fled to the Kabul airport, there was gunfire shot at them. They say it was a peaceful transition of power with occasional gunfire behind it, so pretty much like the BLM riots in the summer of 2020, peaceful in that sense. There's about 6,000 troops total in Afghanistan, soon to be 7,000, and as I mentioned earlier, the U.S. goal is to fly out 5,000 civilians a day, which is a very low number when you consider that there's 100,000 citizens in Afghanistan. And while some of them may agree with the Taliban, I imagine most of them don't. At least that's what we're seeing from all these protests that are being lit up with gunfire, and all the different videos of people pleading for the president to not treat them dirty like he is. Sam Learman, a U.S. Air Force veteran, said that this was murder by incompetence, which really, I don't know, you have to see it from Biden's perspective. So from his point of view, first off, he's an idiot, we all know this, But he also, I mean, this was his big point. He was always for pulling the troops out of Afghanistan, which in itself is probably a good thing. I mean, make America focused on America, get rid of all their ties in the rest of the world, and while that's not realistic at all in any sense of the word, it's definitely, it's a very interesting value set to be focused on your country over the well-being of countries of others. Now, I personally think on that, we owe a moral responsibility to others just because we have been born with this freedom, that we should, try to bestow freedom upon others, even if it is at cost of life and limb. But I totally understand the other argument on that. That's their country and their problems. They're responsible for their own country, we're responsible for ours. And our country is in a load of crap itself, so we should probably be focused on fixing our country before we focus on saving Afghanistan. But I think we could do two things at once, especially with us being a more traditionally warrior-esque, I mean, just country full of fighters. It makes more sense for us to constantly be out searching for blood, more or less, than to, be focused on the homestead. You never get anything good with a fighter locked at home. The fighters are best overseas fighting. But to view this as murder by incompetence, Biden has to have known that this would turn out in such a rotten way. I mean, there's no way for the president to not have at least some information on that. Hey, the Taliban will take over if you leave like this. Why don't you do it more steadily, or wait for the winter for them to not fight? Or maybe leave some aid, leave some contractors, just leave the people of Afghanistan something to use to help them out in this war. But instead he pulled out pretty much cold turkey, just ripped that band-aid right off, and now we're getting a Taliban takeover, including their takeover of a couple $1 billion of weapons, lots of light ammunition, Humvees, Blackhawks, RPGs, a ton of ARs and AKs, just a horrible sight to see. Just watching the videos of them sprue out their American weapons on the ground, it's horrifying to see their lack of, respect for the weapons, but then it's also just horrifying to see these fools of people with that much heavy artillery. It's a really shocking sight to see. And yeah, this is all the Commander-in-Chief's fault. He is the one in charge of warfare. That's the president's duty, is to call the tough shots, and this president has chosen to abandon all the people in Afghanistan. Whether that's for good or bad, I guess we'll find out. Right now, it seems pretty bad. But, there's always that redemption shot. Maybe 2 years down the line this pans out in America's favor, or maybe 2 years down the line we have another 9/11. I guess we'll have to wait and see. The bottom line is, there is the semblance of an evac plan in the making. Really, this was a roughshod deal in the first place, so any notice of an evac plan was out the window from the start. But everything there is crap. People are and will continue to die under the Taliban rule, and practically everyone is against Biden in this one. Even the beloved media is just trashing him because of how crappy of a job he's done in Afghanistan. But Biden did put his foot down. He declared that this was his ideal, this is what he was doing, the buck stops with him, as he said, and it's everybody else's fault for the fact that it's not working out. And no U.S. aid will go to Afghanistan in the near future. Now, if the Taliban does inherit a humanitarian side to them, if they include women in their politics, in between the raping sessions, then the U.S. might give them some aid. I know there was some talk about that, but I really didn't do any far research into that, much of it. But pretty much it's a done deal, it's a real crap show, and I guess we'll just have to wait and see what happens in Afghanistan. And as for now, this is just the patriot perspective of it all.